Imagine waiting all day on your birthday, watching the clock tick, the tea grow cold, and the silence grow louder. No one came, not my children, not my grandchildren, no one. That was the moment I picked up the phone, not to call my family, but to call my lawyer. My name is Elaine, though most people in Manchester simply call me Grandad. It's strange how you lose your name when you grow older. You become someone's father, someone's grandfather, or just the old man at the corner house. But tonight, on my birthday, in this quiet home of mine, I felt less like a grandfather and more like a forgotten shadow in my own story. I had been preparing for this day for weeks. Birthdays don't mean much when you reach your 70s. Not to most people anyway. But for me, it was a chance, perhaps the last chance, to see my family together under one roof again. I'd polished the wooden dining table until it gleamed, laid out the plates and cutlery I inherited from my late wife Margaret, and even baked a sponge cake the way she used to, with raspberry jam and fresh cream. Margaret always said, "It's not about the cake, Elaine, it's about the love behind it." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked away, steady and indifferent. At 6 in the evening, I was sure my son David would pull up in his car, his 2 children tumbling out with birthday cards and noisy chatter. My daughter Emma had promised a call from New York, even though the time difference made it tricky. I set my phone on the table beside me, volume on high, waiting for it to light up. But 6 turned into 7, and 7 slipped into 1/2 past. The silence in the house was unbearable. I tried to mask it by turning on the old radio, but even the cheerful voices of BBC presenters only made the room feel emptier. I switched it off and sat back in my chair, staring at the cake as though it might suddenly bring everyone home. I told myself they were probably stuck in traffic. Manchester can be unforgiving on a Friday night, especially near Deansgate. Imagine David apologizing as he came through the door, saying, "Sorry Dad, the M62 was a nightmare." I rehearsed the smile I'd give him, pretending none of the waiting mattered. But when 8 o'clock came and went, hope began to thin out like smoke. The living room, once so full of life, now mocked me with its emptiness. The family photographs lining the shelves seemed to stare back at me. There was David in his graduation gown from the University of Leeds, Emma at her wedding in Oxford, her eyes shining with joy, and there was Margaret, standing beside me in nearly every picture, her arm linked through mine as though she'd known all along that one day I would need her strength even after she was gone. I picked up one of the photographs of family Christmas in 1992. The children were small. The house was bursting with wrapping paper, and Margaret had made her famous roast. I could almost hear the crackle of the fire and smell the mulled wine. Looking at that picture, I asked myself quietly, where did all that love go? By 9 o'clock, the cake had begun to sag slightly, cream softening under the kitchen lights. I hadn't taken a single slice. What was the point? Cake is meant to be shared, laughter cutting through each bite. Eating it alone felt like admitting defeat. The loneliness pressed heavier with each tick of the clock. I tried to busy myself straightening the already straight cushions, pacing the length of the rug, pouring myself a small glass of sherry. But the truth couldn't be disguised. I had been forgotten. On birthdays people say you should feel celebrated. Instead, I felt invisible. I thought of the neighbors across the street, the Harpers, who were probably gathered around a noisy dinner table right now. Their house glowed with warmth through the curtains. My house, though well kept, seemed like a museum, tidy, cold, silent. I sat back down in my chair and whispered out loud, "Happy birthday, Elaine." The sound of my own voice startled me. It was the first time I'd spoken in hours. The empty living room was more than just a room without people. It was a mirror of my own heart. For decades, this house had been the stage of my life's greatest joys and deepest sorrows. I remembered the day David was born, when Margaret and I rushed back here with a tiny bundle wrapped in hospital blankets, our hearts bursting with pride. I remembered Emma learning to play the piano in that very corner, her little fingers stumbling over the keys while Margaret cheered her on. I remembered birthdays past when friends and neighbors filled every chair, when Margaret and I stayed up late washing dishes but feeling rich beyond measure because our home had been alive. And now, here I was, a man in his 70s, surrounded by memories instead of people. The walls seemed to echo back what was missing. Voices, footsteps, laughter. All that remained was me, the ticking clock, and a cake untouched. I tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe David had thought Emma would organize something. Or perhaps Emma assumed David would. Perhaps tomorrow they'd both call, full of apologies. But deep down, a sharper truth gnawed at me. I had become a footnote in their busy lives, a duty they remembered only when convenient. By 9:30, I turned on the small lamp by the sofa. The soft light spilled across the room, and in that moment, I realized something important. The waiting wasn't just about tonight. It was about years of waiting for calls that never came, waiting for visits that kept getting postponed, waiting for promises that dissolved into silence. Tonight wasn't just an empty birthday. It was the proof of something I had been afraid to admit, that the bond I had once believed unbreakable had worn thin, almost invisible. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, listening to the house breathe. It was quiet, yes, but not cruel. The cruelty came from the absence of those I loved most. And as the night grew darker, I felt a new heaviness settle in my chest, not anger, but resolve. This living room, empty as it was, had just given me an answer I didn't want, but desperately needed. If my family would not stand beside me, then perhaps it was time I stood for myself. When the house grew too silent that evening, I found myself retreating into the only place where sound still lived at past. Memories have a peculiar way of sneaking in when you least expect them. They arrive uninvited, and once they're in, they sit down in the front row of your mind, demanding to be seen. That night, on my birthday, I could hear the echoes of birthdays long gone, as though the walls themselves were whispering them back to me. I remember my 35th birthday, as though it happened yesterday. Margaret had organized a surprise party in our old house in Leeds. I had just come home from a long shift at the shop back then. I owned a small corner store near Kirkcaldy Market. I was exhausted, smelling faintly of flour and tea leaves, and when I pushed open the door, the living room exploded with laughter and cheers. Neighbors, friends, even some of my regular customers were there, all crammed into that modest room. Margaret stood in the middle, beaming, holding little David. He must have been about 3 at the time, clapping his tiny hands along with everyone else. Emma was just a baby, lying in her crib by the sofa, gurgling and kicking her feet, already stealing hearts without even trying. Margaret had baked me a Victoria sponge, layered with jam and dusted with icing sugar. The smell of it still lingers in my memory, sweet and warm. When she carried it out, candles flickering, I remember thinking, I am the luckiest man alive, not because of the cake, or even the party, but because of the love that filled every inch of that room. Birthdays in those days were never quiet affairs. Even when money was tightened, God knows it often was, Margaret found ways to make the day feel grand. She'd rally the children to help with decorations, cutting out paper chains, hanging balloons from the ceiling with bits of string. The kitchen would be alive with the smell of roast chicken or shepherd's pie, and the dining table, though not lavish, was always set with care. I remember David's laughter most of all. As a boy, he had a laugh that could fill a house. It was wild, unrestrained, the kind of laugh that made other children join in, even if they didn't know the joke. On my 45th birthday, he insisted on helping his mother bake the cake. The result was half a sponge that leaned dangerously to one side, but I ate it as though it were the finest confection in England. Emma, by then about 10, played Happy Birthday on the piano, her small fingers determined to get every note right. She missed a few, of course, but when Margaret leaned over to kiss my cheek, she whispered, "It's the most beautiful music in the world, isn't it?" And it truly was. I often think back to my 50th birthday. That one was special. Margaret, ever the organizer, had rented a hall in Leeds. She invited everyone we knew, family, neighbors, even old school friends I hadn't seen in decades. There must have been over 50 people there. I stood in that hall, overwhelmed by the sight of faces smiling at me, voices calling out, "Happy birthday, Elaine." For a moment, I felt like a king. Margaret wore her favorite navy dress, the one with the white floral pattern. I can still picture her twirling under the dim lights, laughing when I clumsily tried to dance beside her. That night, she leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "This is what life is, Elaine. Not money, not things, just this. Us, surrounded by love." Those words carved themselves into my heart, though I didn't realize how much I would cling to them later. Even in smaller moments, birthdays were sacred in our family. Margaret had a rule: no one was allowed to skip them. Even if David had football practice or Emma had exams, birthdays meant gathering together. One day, Margaret used to say, you'll look back and realize these are the only days that mattered. She was right, as she always was. After she passed away, the birthdays changed. She died on a cold March morning, and for a long time after, it felt impossible to celebrate anything. My 62nd birthday was the first without her. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too cold. But David and Emma came, determined to keep her tradition alive. They cooked dinner, brought a store-bought cake, and though it wasn't the same, it warmed me to see them trying. I remember Emma setting the table and whispering, "Mum would have wanted this." For a few years, they kept at it. We'd gather, not always with the same enthusiasm as before, but at least with effort. The grandchildren came into the picture, tiny hands tugging at my shirt, shy smiles as they offered handmade cards. I saved every single one of those cards. Some are still tucked away in a drawer upstairs. The colors faded, but the love still visible in every crooked letter and misshapen heart. But as the years went by, the gatherings grew smaller. David would call to say work kept him late in London. Emma, once so diligent about traditions, moved across the Atlantic, promising to call but often forgetting. The grandchildren grew older, busier, less interested in sitting with an old man in Manchester. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, birthdays turned from celebrations into afterthoughts. And yet, in my mind, those past birthdays remain vivid, untouched by time. I can still hear Margaret's voice calling everyone to the table. I can still feel the warmth of a crowded room, smell the candles as I blew them out, taste the laughter as it mingled with cake. That night, sitting in my empty living room, I clung to those memories like a drowning man clings to driftwood. They were proof that once I had been loved deeply, openly, fiercely. They reminded me that my life had not always been this quiet, that I had once been surrounded by joy so loud it drowned out loneliness. And yet, the cruelest part of memory is that it doesn't stay in the past, it seeps into the present, demanding you compare what was with what is. Looking back, I realized how far I had drifted from those golden days. What used to be sacred had been reduced to silence. What used to be certain had become fragile. As I sat there, remembering, I found myself speaking into the stillness. "Margaret, you were right. These were the only days that mattered. And now, they're gone." The living room stayed silent, but in my mind, the echoes of birthdays past refused to fade. Promises, they sound so sturdy when they are spoken, like stone pillars that can hold up the weight of trust. But with time, I've learned that many promises are made of glass. They glitter in the moment, but under pressure, they shatter. That night, as I sat alone in my Manchester living room, waiting for my family to arrive, my mind kept circling back to all the promises that had led me here. David, my eldest, had called me just a week before. His voice, always hurried these days, carried that usual tone of reassurance he used when he wanted to quiet me without truly listening. "Of course, we'll come, Dad," he said. "Wouldn't miss your birthday for the world." I remember smiling as I hung up, choosing to believe him, though some part of me knew better. David was once my shadow. As a boy, he followed me everywhere, down to the shop, into the garden, even to the pub on Sundays when he was old enough for a lemonade while I had a pint. He was eager to learn, eager to please. When I fixed shelves in the kitchen, he held the nails. When I painted the fence, he held the brush, dripping paint all over his shoes. I thought we were unbreakable, a father and son forged by shared work and simple joys. But time has a way of thinning even the strongest bonds. After Margaret passed, David grew distant. At first, I told myself it was his way of grieving. He had a family of his own, his wife, Claire, and their children, Thomas and Lily. He had responsibilities, bills, a demanding job in London. I excused the missed visits, the hurried phone calls. I told myself he would come around. That blood was thicker than schedules. Yet the promises kept piling up like unpaid debts. He promised to visit at Christmas 2 years ago. I cooked, I cleaned, I waited. On Christmas Eve, he called, his voice guilty but firm. "Sorry, Dad, the trains are a mess, and we've decided to stay put. We'll come in January, I swear." January came and went. He never showed. Then there was Emma, my youngest, my bright star. From the moment she learned to speak, she was a dreamer. She wanted to study abroad, to see the world beyond England's shores. Margaret and I sacrificed to make it possible. I sold the little shop in Leeds, money that might have been my retirement cushion, so she could go to Oxford and later chase opportunities overseas. I was proud, even when it hurt. When Emma moved to New York, I told myself distance wouldn't change her heart. "Dad, I'll call every week," she promised at the airport, tears in her eyes as she hugged me tightly. And for a while, she did. Sunday evenings became our ritual. I'd sit by the phone, waiting for it to ring, and she'd tell me about her work, her new friends, the city that never seemed to sleep. Her voice lit up my week, but then the calls grew shorter. Weeks turned into months, excuses piled up. "Sorry, Dad, I had a meeting." "Sorry, Dad, the time difference makes it hard." "Sorry, Dad, I'll make it up to you next time." Next time, always next time. On my last birthday, Emma sent a text message, just a line: "Happy birthday, Dad. Love you, X." I stared at it for hours, debating whether I should be grateful she remembered or heartbroken that a message on a glowing screen had replaced the sound of her voice. This year, she promised she'd call. She promised. I held on to that word, as if it were a lifeline. But as the night dragged on, my phone remained stubbornly silent, its black screen reflecting my own weary face. It's strange, isn't it, how the ones you love most can wound you without even realizing. They don't mean to. At least, I like to think they don't. Life swallows them, whole jobs, mortgages, children, ambitions, and yet, I can't help but remember all the times I put aside my own dreams for them. When David wanted to buy his first house in London, he didn't have enough for the deposit. I gave him nearly everything I had left from the sale of the shop. Margaret had warned me, "Keep some for yourself, Elaine. You'll need it one day." But I waved her off. "What kind of father would I be if I didn't help?" I said. "David promised to pay me back." He never did. "He promised to visit more often." He didn't. When Emma struggled with her tuition fees, I took out a loan. Margaret and I tightened our belts, cut corners, lived more simply. Emma promised she'd make us proud, promised she'd never forget where she came from, and she did. Make us proud, Oxford, New York, a career that made headlines in her small circles. But somewhere along the way, remembering where she came from seemed to slip through her fingers. The promises weren't just about money or visits. They were about love, about connection, about the invisible thread that holds families together. Every broken promise was a tiny cut. One or two might have healed quickly, but after years, the cuts became scars, and the scars ached on nights like this. I sat there, staring at the phone, thinking of all the times I had told them, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." That was my promise to them. I promised not to burden them, not to complain, not to make them feel guilty. I kept my promise, but theirs were left in the dust. And so the silence of my birthday wasn't just silence, it was the sound of promises broken, one after another, until all that remained was an old man in a quiet room, clinging to memories of words that were never kept. There is a particular kind of silence that creeps into a house when you are waiting for someone who never comes. It is not the peaceful silence of dawn, nor the quiet of a countryside evening. No, this silence is heavy. It presses against your chest, sharp and suffocating, like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. That night, on my birthday, as the minutes bled into hours, I came to know that silence intimately. I sat in my armchair by the front window of my Manchester home, a place I had chosen deliberately. From there, I could see the narrow street, lined with semi-detached houses much like mine, the windows glowing with life. Every pair of headlights that appeared at the end of the road sent a flutter of hope through me. Maybe this is them. Maybe David is finally here. Maybe Emma has flown in as a surprise. But each time, the cars slowed, turned, and vanished into driveways that were not mine. I watched neighbors greeted by hugs, families gathering at their doors, children skipping inside with the excitement only youth can muster. My own door remained closed, my drive empty, my house still. The clock on the wall ticked louder as the night wore on, though of course it hadn't changed. Funny how time seems to exaggerate itself when you are waiting. By 7:30, my eyes were fixed on it. By 8, I had memorized the sound of every tick, every tock, until it felt as though the clock was mocking me. They're not coming. They're not coming. I tried to distract myself. I picked up a book, a novel Margaret had loved, but after a few pages I realized I had read the same sentence over and over without absorbing a word. My eyes skimmed the lines, but my ears strained for the sound of footsteps outside, a knock at the door, the vibration of my phone. None came. The cake sat untouched on the dining table, its candles waiting patiently. I had lit them once, at 7. a clock, thinking perhaps it would make the room feel warmer, more welcoming. But staring at those flames alone felt pitiful, so I blew them out before they had a chance to burn down. A thin curl of smoke rose into the air, and I thought to myself, so that's it then. That's my celebration. The longer I waited, the more I began to bargain with myself. Give them until 8:30, I thought. Surely they'll come by then. When 8:30 passed, I moved the goalpost again. 9. They'll be here by 9. Maybe they had dinner first. Maybe they wanted to surprise me late. But the truth grew harder to deny with each passing minute. I began to imagine excuses. Before they were even spoken, David tied up with work, Emma caught in some meeting across the ocean, the grandchildren with plans of their own, all plausible, all forgivable on any ordinary day, but not today, not my birthday. There is something cruel about hope when it lingers too long. It becomes less a comfort and more a torment, stretching the heart thin until it frays. By 9:15, I realized I was not waiting for them anymore. I was waiting for myself to finally admit they weren't coming. The living room around me felt different as the night deepened. Shadows stretched across the carpet, the once bright corners fading into darkness. I switched on a lamp, but its light only highlighted the emptiness of the chairs around the table, each one set for someone who hadn't arrived. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I almost cleared the table right then, just to erase the evidence of my foolishness. But I didn't. Some part of me still held on. I poured myself a small glass of sherry, the same way I had done every birthday for decades. Margaret used to join me, raising her glass with that soft smile of hers, her eyes crinkling at the edges. "Another year, Elaine," she would say, clinking her glass against mine. "May we always face them together." But there was no clink that night, only the dull sound of glass against wood as I set it down beside me. I sipped it slowly, the warmth in my chest, a poor substitute for the warmth of family. At some point, I found myself whispering aloud, "Maybe next year." The words sounded pathetic, even to me. Next year, what guarantee was there of a next year? At my age, every birthday feels like both a gift and a reminder that the sand in the hourglass is running low. To waste one in silence felt like theft stolen, not by strangers, but by the very people I loved most. The hardest part of waiting is not the absence of footsteps at the door, it is the way your own mind begins to betray you. I imagined their lives without me, spinning happily onward. David, perhaps at a dinner with colleagues in London, raising a toast without sparing me a thought. Emma, her phone buzzing with messages from friends in New York. My birthday, nothing more than a small reminder she had dismissed hours ago. My grandchildren, caught up in the glow of screens, forgetting their grandfather's face. I sat there, and the truth crept in slowly, like a draft through a cracked window. I was not forgotten because they couldn't reach me. I was forgotten because they did not try. When the clock struck 10, I finally let the weight of it settle. My body slumped back into the chair, the sherry glass empty in my hand. The waiting was over. There was no point in bargaining with the night anymore. They were not coming. And yet, even then, I didn't clear the table. I left the plates, the cutlery, the untouched cake. Perhaps some part of me wanted the house itself to witness my disappointment, to remember this night as clearly as I would. Perhaps I wanted proof not just for myself, but for the walls, the furniture, the ghosts of birthdays past, that I had waited, and they had not come. That wait was more than an evening. It was the accumulation of years, of promises deferred, of love taken for granted. It was every phone call that ended too quickly, every visit postponed, every excuse I had swallowed with a smile. That night, the waiting crystallized into something undeniable. I was no longer a priority in their lives. As the night grew colder, I stood by the window one last time, peering out into the street. It was empty now, the glow from neighboring houses dimming as families settled into sleep. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, an old man, tired, foolishly hopeful. I whispered to him, "No more waiting." It was a promise, but this time, it was one I intended to keep. There comes a moment in every life when patience runs out. It doesn't happen suddenly, like a slammed door. Rather, it builds quietly, one small disappointment at a time, until the weight is too much to carry. That night, on my birthday, after hours of waiting, something inside me cracked. It wasn't anger, not exactly, it was something deeper, sharper, more permanent. It was the breaking point. I remember sitting at the dining table, staring at the untouched cake, 10 candles sat crooked in their holders. Little wax rivers hardened along their sides from when I had lit them earlier in some foolish burst of hope. The cake had begun to droop, the cream softening under the kitchen light. It looked tired, much like me. And that's when the memories started flooding in, not the joyful kind I had clung to before, but the bitter ones, the ones I usually kept. Locked away, I thought of the sacrifices. When David was ready to buy his first house in London, he rang me in a panic. He and Claire had found the perfect semi-detached home, but the bank wouldn't lend them the full amount. He needed help. Margaret was still alive then. She and I had saved carefully for years, money that was meant to cushion our old age. We had plans for a little cottage in the Lake District, maybe, where we could spend our final years surrounded by hills and quiet streams. But when David called, begging for help, I couldn't refuse. "We'll manage, won't we, love?" I had said to Margaret, holding her hand. She hesitated, her brow furrowed, but then she nodded. "He's out, son," she whispered. So I handed over nearly everything we had saved. David promised he would pay it back. He promised he would never forget what we had done for him. But life moved on. David settled into his new home, raised his children, built his career. The money never came back. The cottage in the Lake District remained a dream. And slowly, visits home grew less frequent, his gratitude replaced by excuses. Then there was Emma. Oh, my Emma, the girl with stars in her eyes. She had always wanted more than this city could give her. When she was accepted into Oxford, Margaret cried, tears of pride, and I told everyone I knew. But Oxford wasn't cheap. The tuition, the books, the living expenses, they mounted higher than we had ever imagined. We tightened our belts, sold the little shop in Leeds, and took out loans. I worked odd jobs long after I should have retired. Emma promised she would remember the sacrifices. She promised she would call every week, write every month, visit as often as she could, and for a while she did. But New York changed her. Or perhaps it was simply life, pulling her in directions that no longer included me. The promises, so many promises, each one broken, each one dismissed as though words carried no weight at all. I had been their anchor, their safety net, their provider, and now, in the twilight of my life, when all I wanted was their presence, I was nothing more than an afterthought. That night, as I sat at the table, my hands trembling slightly, I realized something. I had given everything, my time, my money, my love, my patience, and what had I received in return? Silence. The breaking point wasn't just about the birthday. It was about the years of waiting, the years of excuses, the years of carrying a one-sided devotion. It was about sitting alone in a house that had once been alive with laughter, now echoing only with the tick of a clock. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sound startled even me. I walked into the living room, past the photographs that lined the shelves. I stopped in front of Juanima, at her graduation, cap and gown, smiling so brightly. I remembered how I had stood in the crowd that day, my chest swelling with pride, tears burning my eyes. I had clapped until my hands hurt, shouting her name above the cheers. And now, where was she? Thousands of miles away, unable to spare even a phone call. Another photograph, David, on the day he moved into his London home, standing proudly in front of the door I had paid for, his arm around Claire, the children giggling at their feet. I remembered the ache in my chest as I drove back to Manchester, knowing I had given up my own dream so that he could build his. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I thought I might collapse. I sank back into my chair, burying my face in my hands. The tears came then, hot and unrelenting. I hadn't cried in years, not since Margaret's funeral. But that night, I wept like a child, not just for the loneliness of the evening, but for every sacrifice that had gone unnoticed, every promise broken, every dream abandoned for the sake of others. I whispered her name, Margaret, over and over, as though she might appear and sit beside me, as though she might take my hand and remind me that it had all been worth it. But the room stayed empty, the silence stayed heavy, and in that silence, something shifted. The breaking point was not just pen, it was clarity. For the first time, I saw the truth without the fog of excuses or the haze of hope. My children loved me, perhaps, but not enough. Not enough to show up, not enough to honor their promises, not enough to give me even one evening of their time. I thought of Margaret's words on my 50th birthday, when we had danced together under dim lights. This is what life is, Elaine, not money, not things. Just this, us, surrounded by love. She had been right, and now, that love was gone. The breaking point was not rigid, was resolve. If they would not give me love, I would not waste the rest of my days waiting for scraps of it. If they could not keep their promises, then I would make a new promise to myself. No more waiting, no more hoping, no more sacrificing for those who could not see me. That night, I felt the crack inside me harden into something stronger. A decision was forming, quiet but steady, like the first stone laid for a new foundation. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not end my days as a forgotten man, sitting alone in a silent house, waiting for doors that never opened. The breaking point had come, and from it, something new would have to begin. The morning after my birthday was different. It wasn't brighter, nor any warmer. The Manchester skies were their usual dull grey, but something inside me had shifted. The house felt the same too, silent, heavy with absence, still carrying the faint smell of last night's candles and stale cake. Yet, when I sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling in my hands, I wasn't the same man who had waited. There, hours before, something had hardened in me. The breaking point had passed, and what remained was resolve. I stared at the phone on the counter, an old landline, the kind that still had weight in the receiver. I had used it for decades, for birthdays, anniversaries, for calls to Margaret when I was running late from the shop, for late-night reassurances to Emma when she felt homesick her first term at Oxford. That phone had carried love, comfort, and connection. Now, it was a reminder of silence. But that morning, for the first time in years, I thought of it not as a tool for begging or waiting, but as a weapon. I had spent a lifetime giving my savings, my time, my energy, and what did I have left? A pension that barely covered the bills, a house filled with echoes, and children who only remembered me when they needed something. I had been useful, once valuable, because I had something to offer. But now, with my body slower, and my wallet thinner, I had become invisible. Margaret would have scolded me for letting it go on this long. She had always been the practical one. "Don't let them take advantage of you, Elaine," she'd say, pressing her hand against mine. But I always brushed her words aside. "There are children," I told myself. "It's not taking advantage, it's love." But was it love? Real love doesn't forget birthdays. Real love doesn't leave you staring at cold cake and empty chairs. Real love doesn't vanish once the bank account is drained or the work is done. That morning the thought began to take root. I didn't have to keep giving. I didn't have to keep waiting. I didn't have to let them shape the final chapters of my life. I could take back control. It wasn't an easy thought. It rattled around in me, clashing with years of habit and duty. But with every sip of tea, with every glance at that silent phone, the idea grew stronger. I thought of the house. This old semi-detached in the heart of Manchester had been mine and Margaret's dream. We had bought it in the late 60s, scrimping and saving, determined to carve out a little corner of stability for our family. The walls had held our laughter, our arguments, our hopes. But now, they held only shadows. Why should it be David's by default? Why should Emma inherit it as though it were her birthright, when neither of them could be bothered to step foot in it anymore? Why should everything Margaret and I built simply be handed over to people who had forgotten the meaning of gratitude? The thought made my chest tighten, not in grief this time, but in something close to defiance. I remembered a conversation I once had with an old friend, Arthur, down at the pub. It must have been 5 or 6 years ago, shortly after Margaret passed. He had leaned in close, pint in hand, and said, "You know, Elaine, you've got more power than you think. Don't go leaving everything to those who don't deserve it. Make them earn it, or give it to someone who'll truly value it." At the time, I laughed him off, but now, those words burned in my mind like an ember waiting to catch. I pushed my tea aside and stood. My legs wobbled, not from weakness but from the weight of the decision forming in me. I walked into the living room, past the rows of photographs, past the dusty shelves, and into the small study where I kept my papers. The drawer of the old desk stuck as it always did, but after a firm tug, it opened. Inside were envelopes, receipts, Margaret's handwriting on yellowed pages, and there, tucked neatly in the corner, was a card. White, embossed, simple. James O'Connor, Solicitor, Family and Property Law. James had helped me years ago when Margaret's will was settled. A kind man, steady voice, no nonsense. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but his card had remained, as though waiting for this very moment. I held it in my hands for a long time, the weight of it far greater than its paper form. Calling him would mean more than just seeking advice. It would mean admitting that my children had failed me. It would mean acknowledging that the people I had loved most in the world had left me behind. It would mean rewriting the ending of my story, perhaps in ways they would not forgive. But what was forgiveness worth if it was never paired with respect? I sat at the desk, card before me, and pulled the phone closer. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed the number. Each ring in my ear felt like a drumbeat, a countdown to a choice that could not be undone. James O'Connor speaking, came the familiar, steady voice. I hesitated. My throat tightened, my words sticking for a moment. Then, with a breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades, I spoke. James, it's Elaine Thompson. I need your help. The words hung in the air, heavy but liberating. For the first time in years, I wasn't calling to beg my children for attention, or to leave a voicemail that would go unanswered. I was calling for myself. I was calling to take back control of my life. James asked me to explain, his tone gentle but professional. And as I told him everything, the silence, the sacrifices, the loneliness, I felt something inside me lift. It was painful, yes, but also freeing, like lancing a wound that had festered too long. When I finished, James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Elaine, you've done more than enough for them. If you're ready, we can put things in writing. Your house, your savings, your will. You can decide exactly what happens, without obligation. You don't owe anyone anything. The words settled over me like a bomb. I didn't owe anyone anything. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. My heart was still racing, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. A new chapter had begun, not one of waiting, but of choosing. Not one of sacrifice, but of self-respect. The decision was made. I would not be forgotten quietly. After I hung up the phone with James, I sat at my desk for what felt like hours. The house was still as ever, but something inside me was different. My chest no longer carried the same weight of despair, carried something sharper, stronger, a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in years. For so long I had thought strength meant enduring, waiting quietly, giving without question, swallowing disappointment with a polite smile. Margaret used to call it my stubborn patience. But what good had it done me? Patience had left me forgotten on my birthday, staring at a cold cake and 4 empty chairs. That morning, I realized patience wasn't strength. Action was. James had told me to come by his office in Leeds the following week. He'd said we could go through everything: my will, the property, the accounts. It's about what you want, Elaine, he'd said firmly. Those words echoed in my mind like a song I couldn't shake. What I want. When was the last time I had asked myself that? I had lived for everyone else for so long, first Margaret, then the children, then even the grandchildren who barely remembered I existed. But what about me? That thought unsettled me at first. It felt selfish, almost sinful. I had been raised to put family above all else. But then another thought followed, quiet and insistent. Had they put me above all else? Had they even put me at all? The answer, painfully clear, was no. That week became a strange blur. I went about my daily routines, but with a new undercurrent, running through everything I did. When I walked to the corner shop for milk, I wasn't just the old man shuffling down the pavement. I was a man with a secret plan. When I sat in the park to feed the pigeons, I wasn't just killing time. I was thinking about how I might leave my mark differently than expected. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing, I was preparing. On Wednesday I pulled down a dusty box from the attic. Inside were Margaret's journals, the children's old drawings, and folders of papers I hadn't looked at in decades. Among them was the deed to the house. My hands trembled as I unfolded the yellowing document. The ink faded, but still legible. There it was. Elaine and Margaret Thompson, joint owners. I traced her name with my finger. Margaret had been gone 8 years, and yet, in that moment, she felt closer than ever. I could almost hear her voice. Do what's right for you, love. Don't let them walk over you. For years I had ignored that voice. Now, finally, I was ready to listen. The day of the appointment came. Leeds was bustling as always. Buses grumbling past, people rushing with takeaway coffees, the air damp with the smell of rain. I hadn't been into the city centre for months, and it felt strange, almost overwhelming. James's office was on a quiet street, tucked between a bakery and a solicitor who specialized in divorces. The brass plaque gleamed, and when I stepped inside, the warmth and polished wood of the reception area steadied me. "Mr. Thompson," James greeted me, rising from behind his desk. He hadn't changed much, same graying hair, same calm eyes behind rimless glasses. He shook my hand firmly, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone saw me not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but as a man who mattered. We sat, and he asked me to tell him everything, and I did. Not just about the house and the will, but about the birthday, the silence, the years of giving without return. As I spoke, I saw no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. When I finished, James leaned back and folded his hands. "Elaine," he said, "you've given them everything. But now it's time you decide how your legacy is written. It's not revenge, it's responsibility. Responsibility to yourself." That word responsibility hit me harder than I expected. I had always thought responsibility meant duty to my children, my family, the people who depended on me. But here was another kind of responsibility, to ensure my final choices reflected my truth, not their neglect. James slid papers across the desk, outlining options. I could leave the house to charity, perhaps a local hospice that had cared for Margaret in her last months. I could set up a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. I could leave small amounts to the children, if I wished, but not the whole of it. The possibilities stretched out before me like open doors, and for the first time in years, I felt the freedom to walk through whichever one I chose. That evening, back in Manchester, I sat by the window with a notebook in hand. The rain tapped against the glass as I began to write, not just figures and names, but thoughts, dreams, even apologies. Apologies not to my children, but to myself for waiting so long, for silencing my own voice. It wasn't easy. Memories rose like ghosts. I remembered teaching David to ride his first bike, running down this very street as he wobbled and laughed. I remembered Emma curled on the sofa, reading her school essays aloud, with a shy smile. They hadn't always been ungrateful. Somewhere along the way, life had hardened them more. Maybe I had simply enabled their forgetfulness by never demanding respect. The pen shook in my hand as I wrote. I love them still, but I cannot let love excuse neglect. Those words, stark and simple, became the anchor for everything that followed. Over the next few weeks, James and I met several times. Each visit, I grew lighter. He drafted a new will. The house, I decided, would go to the hospice. My modest savings would support a scholarship for local youth. A small amount would be left to David and Emma, not out of obligation, but as a reminder that their father had not forgotten them, even if they had forgotten him. Some nights, doubt clawed at me. Was I being too harsh? Was I betraying the very idea of family? But then I would recall the silence of my birthday, the cake untouched, the hours ticking by, and I knew this wasn't betrayal. This was balance. The strangest thing happened as I made these decisions. I began to feel stronger in other parts of my life too. I started walking further, venturing beyond the park to streets I hadn't wandered in years. I rejoined the local library, borrowing novels and history books that kept my mind alive. I even chatted with neighbors, surprising myself with how easy it felt. It was as though, in reclaiming control of my will and my house, I had reclaimed control of myself. Strength, I learned, wasn't about waiting for others to remember you. It was about remembering yourself. One evening, I stood at Margaret's grave, flowers in hand. The sky was painted in soft pinks, the kind she used to love. I knelt, pressing the blooms into the soil, and whispered, "I've done it, love. I've finally done it." For the first time since she passed, I didn't feel only loss. I felt partnership, as though she was beside me, nodding, proud. That night, I slept deeply, without the ache of regret gnawing at me. I had discovered a new kind of strength, not in holding on to those who forgot me, but in choosing a legacy that would outlive me with dignity. The day I signed the final version of my will, the air in Leeds carried that damp chill particular to autumn. James laid the papers neatly in front of me, his fountain pen poised like a judge's gavel. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name across each page, but it wasn't weakness, it was release. Each stroke of ink severed an old chain and replaced it with something lighter, freer. "Congratulations, Elaine," James said softly, once the final signature was done. "You've put your affairs in order, on your terms. I nodded, though a lump rose in my throat. I hadn't realized until that moment how much of my life had been lived on other people's terms. Children, grandchildren, expectations, traditions. Now, in these papers, my truth lived. The house to the hospice. The savings to a scholarship fund. Modest amounts for David and Emma. A legacy not of neglect, but of balance. Weeks passed quietly after that. Life returned to its small routines: morning tea, afternoon walks, evenings with a book by the fire. But beneath it all was a calm certainty. I had chosen, I had acted. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the truth would come to light. It happened one Sunday, just as the church bells in Manchester were ringing noon. I was sitting with a crossword puzzle when the phone rang. Dad, it was David, his voice taut, unfamiliar. He rarely called. What's this about the will? My stomach clenched. Word had reached them faster than I expected. Perhaps James had notified them, or perhaps whispers had traveled through some legal channel. What about it? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Silence on the other end. Then, an incredulous laugh. The house, Dad, to a hospice. Do you realize what you're doing? I closed the crossword and folded my hands. I know exactly what I'm doing. The conversation spiraled from there. David raised his voice, his words sharp with accusation. He spoke of family duty, of inheritance, of how unfair it was. He spoke as though my life's work existed solely for him to claim. Unfair. I finally interrupted, my voice firmer than I'd planned. David, do you know what was unfair? Sitting alone on my birthday, waiting for hours. Not a call, not a knock, not even a card. That was unfair. He went quiet then. The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost wounded. So this is punishment? No, I said gently. This is truth. My truth. I love you. But love isn't blind, and it isn't endless giving without return. It's balance. It's respect. And I will not leave behind a legacy that tells the world I was forgotten in life and obedient in death. He had no answer. Eventually, he muttered something about speaking to Emma and hung up. Days later, Emma came. Unlike her brother, she didn't shout. She arrived at the house, coat still damp from the rain, and stood awkwardly in the hall. Dad, she said quietly, is it true? I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped. Why didn't you talk to us first? I studied her face. She looked older than I remembered, the lines deeper around her eyes. But in that moment, she was still the little girl, clutching her school essays, waiting for my praise. I tried. Emma, I said. I tried for years with dinners, with invitations, with birthdays. I spoke without words, but none of you listened. So I spoke in the only way I could. Her eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back. We didn't mean to forget you. I felt a pang then, sharp and deep. Maybe not, but you did, and forgetting hurts as much as meaning. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she whispered, I suppose I thought you'd always be there. That was the crux of it. They had counted on my patience, my endless giving. They had mistaken endurance for permanence. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. I won't always be here, Emma. None of us will. That's why this matters. In the weeks that followed, word of my decision rippled through the family. The grandchildren, most of them too busy with their own lives, barely reacted. But David simmered with resentment, while Emma drifted between sorrow and acceptance. Oddly enough, I felt no guilt. For the first time, I felt respected, if not by them, then by myself. And then, something unexpected happened. The hospice, upon learning of my planned gift, invited me for a visit. I hadn't set foot there since Margaret's last days. Walking through the halls, I smelled the faint mix of antiseptic and flowers, heard the gentle hum of nurses' shoes on linoleum. But instead of the heaviness I remembered, there was a strange peace. A nurse showed me a new wing under construction, bright rooms with wide windows overlooking a small garden. This, she said with a smile, is where your gift will go. To finish this space, to give comfort. I felt my throat tighten. To think that my old house, the place where Margaret and I had built our lives, would transform into care for strangers, was bittersweet, but also beautiful. My legacy would not be dust or quarrels. It would be light, comfort, dignity. The scholarship, too, began to take form. James connected me with a local foundation, and I found myself sitting at a meeting in a drafty community center. surrounded by bright-eyed students with dreams bigger than I could fathom. They spoke of medicine, of art, of teaching. Their energy filled the room, and for the first time in years, I felt part of something new, something future-facing. One young woman, Aisha, thanked me directly. "You don't know what this means," she said earnestly. "You're giving us a chance." I smiled, my eyes burning. "No, Aisha, you're giving me one." As the months rolled on, the sting of my birthday faded. Not because the pain vanished, but because it transformed. What had once been a wound was now a scar tender. Yes, but also proof of survival. And though David remained distant, Emma visited more often. Sometimes she brought her children, shy at first, but warming over cups of tea and stories of when their mother was young. Slowly, cautiously, a bridge began to rebuild. Not the same as before, perhaps never the same, but something honest, without illusion. One evening, as she was leaving, Emma paused at the door. "I think I understand now, Dad," she said, softly. "You weren't just giving things away, you were reminding us who you are." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Exactly, love, exactly." And so, my legacy was revealed, not just in papers signed and funds allocated, but in the way my choices reshaped the truth. I had thought, on that lonely birthday, that being forgotten was the end of my story. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I remembered myself, and ensured the world would too. When I'm gone, there will be no gold-plated inheritance, no bitter quarrels over who gets what. Instead, there will be comfort for the dying, hope for the young, and perhaps a reminder to my family that love isn't measured by what you receive, but by what you give with purpose. And if they never fully understand, that's all right, because I do, and that's it.